My name is Rob Best, and I am the Director of Projects and Education for ESW. And I'm joined tonight by Karen Kaminsky, pardon me, Karen, who's our Director of Communications, who's going to be one of the other instructors for the course. So we want to take a moment and, first of all, introduce ourselves, give a little bit of our background, and then talk a little bit about the course logistics before we get into the material for tonight, which is an introduction to why we care about energy efficiency in buildings, what some of the overarching policies and programs are around energy efficiency, and then motivate next week when we'll start talking about retrofits and building energy design. So to start, I'll share a little bit about my background. For those who don't know me and only know me as ESW's Director of Projects and Education, I am also currently finishing my PhD at Stanford University in the Sustainable Design and Construction program, which focuses very heavily on energy efficient building design. And in fact, this was my background before I came to Stanford, where I was working for a consultant doing lead audits, energy modeling, and a variety of commissioning and installation activities for energy efficient buildings. I now actually am going to be taking a job at ERIC, which is one of the global leaders in sustainable design. Once I finish my PhD as well, working as a mechanical engineer in a similar field here. So now I will allow Karen to introduce herself briefly as well. Karen?
All right. Hi, everyone. I'm Karen Kaminsky. I'm the Director of Communications and Technology at ESW. I also work in Chicago for a nonprofit called Elevate Energy that focuses on energy efficiency for low income within the city of Chicago and the state of Illinois. So I work specifically with apartment building owners to help improve the energy efficiency, the comfort, the health and safety of buildings within Chicago. I do a bunch of energy modeling. I work with the policy side of things to try and improve energy efficiency policies in the state of Illinois. And I've been doing that for about 2 years. My background's in chemical engineering, but found a way to apply it to buildings, and it's been pretty great.
Awesome. Thanks so much for sharing, Karen. And we'll be joined in certain weeks by Erin Lennox as well, who's our third co-instructor. And Erin is also one of our directors of projects projects coordinators, pardon me, at ESW headquarters. And Erin also is a PhD in engineering and economics, and she currently teaches courses in ecological economics and has done some work as well in the retrofit and building industry. So to talk a little bit about course logistics, we've got a 5-course session planned out for you, which we think is a really good overview of all of the issues pertaining to energy efficient buildings, both on the retrofit side, which you just heard Karen talk about as part of her work, and on the policy side, which she also has a great deal of experience in, and then how we model and design new buildings and measures that might help reduce the energy footprint of all sorts of different designs. So we're going to talk next week a lot about existing buildings and retrofits before we move into energy modeling and whole building design. Erin will join us for some interesting topics on alternative building designs, things like compressed earth and hay bale construction that are not typical in most of our buildings in the built environment and the urban environment, but that can have huge energy saving properties as well. And then in week 5, we're debating a couple of different potential special topics on advanced building energy efficiency design, and we'll probably poll all of you guys after next week to see which of those would be most engaging after you've gotten your feet wet a little bit, so we can really tailor this to all of you, since really this course is designed to help you. The format, you guys have already joined the first session, so you know what time it is. It's going to be weekly at 8 p.m. Eastern, 5 p.m. Pacific here on GoToWebinar. Starting next week, we'll have an optional half-hour session when one of the instructors will be present to answer questions or engage in any discussion that you have about the material from the week before, or anything that's outside of the scope of the class, or that you just need some additional dialogue with. We'll just always be on over my. As you may have seen already, if you've taken a look at the syllabus or course materials, we'll have some weekly readings, some weekly activities that you can engage in. These are designed. Oh, sorry if I'm cutting out a little bit here. Maybe the wireless where I am is not the greatest. So to back up a step, we've got some weekly readings and activities that we'll share as we go. You'll see those populate on our Google Drive, which is the main forum for you to interact with the course material. And then if you miss a class, everything's going to be recorded and posted on our ESW YouTube channel. And then we'll share those links with you, so if you want to review any of the material or if you miss a class, you can catch up there. As I mentioned before, we have a Google Drive site for the course. You should have received a link to that in the registration email from GoToWebinar from us when you originally registered. Folders for each week of the class, where you'll find the slides for the week, any activity slides which will interact with in that today when we have syllabus in there, and that's where you'll also find readings and assignments. It's also where you will submit assignments that are due for the following week. We'll go over that a little bit at the end of class when we get to the first assignment, and we may populate that as well throughout the course with some additional materials that are optional or extra, just to get you more background if you want to go deeper into some of the topics that we discuss in the class. The forum that we use is GoToWebinar, GoToMeeting, and if you've never used this before, you'll notice that in your panel you have options to unmute and mute yourself. Everybody's muted by default, which we find really helpful for audibility. However, if you do have a question, please feel free to use the button there to raise your hand. We will see that and we will unmute you. If you have a microphone and would like to ask your question in person, we do value the ability to hear people's voices and share on that level. And as we go through some of the activities too, we'll ask for people who want to volunteer and share their responses to some of the in-class activities. And again, if you have a microphone, we would love to be able to unmute you and have you share and have everybody hear your voice. The other way you can communicate with us is that you have the questions box. So if you don't have a microphone or don't want to speak up, maybe you're in a loud place, or just would rather submit your question by text, you can type it in there, and again, one of the instructors will see it. We'll answer the questions as we go. Some we may reserve to the end just because they may be better once we've gone through some more material, but we'll try to answer them as they come through. If you have any technical questions, do feel free to ask those about how GoToMeeting, GoToWebinar works. We can answer those just as equally well as we can with any of the materials questions for the class. So that's a little bit of logistics and mechanics, and the last time that we'll have to go through that, because from now on you'll all be pros at GoToMeeting, and you can get on the Google Drive. By the way, if you have any issues with accessing any of the course resources, you can email me, Karen, or Andrew Beck, all of whom are ESW HQ volunteers. You can find our email addresses on the ESW website. We'll also provide them to you separately in an email after the class session tonight, so that you have a quick resources guide in case you have any technical difficulties. Or again, questions about the course, feel free to email us between weeks as well, and we're happy to respond to those. So with that, Karen, I'm going to turn things over to you to kick us off with an introduction to energy use in the built environment.
All right, thanks, Rob. So just to get us started, I want to look a little bit at how household energy use has changed from 1978 to now. So you can see two graphs here, and kind of in the past, space heating, so heating your building with gas, with electricity, with whatever, has taken up such a large portion of your energy use, followed by water heating, appliances, and electronics. And since then, in 2005, the amount of energy use within a building has stayed about the same, but you can see that the appliances and electronics has gone up dramatically. So a lot of this is due to changes in codes throughout the years. A lot of codes are focused on efficiency of space heating technologies, cooling, things like that. But those changes are being negated by lifestyle changes. So larger homes, which you can see on the right there, central air conditioning, multiple TVs in the home, computers, things like that. So on the next slide. Rob? So on the commercial side, it's kind of the same story. There's a lot of energy use in space heating. Lighting is much more of a concern there. You can see the larger focus there, as well as cooling. And then other concerns that you don't even think about in households, like ventilation, higher usage of cooking, computers, things like that. So these are all opportunities for efficiency to kind of reduce the energy use as you go. Personally, my biggest area of expertise is in space heating, in improving insulation, and things like that. Starting to learn a lot more about the lighting. And so you might be wondering what kind of codes people govern energy efficiency. So if you go to the next slide, there are a bunch of different building rating systems that I'm going to go through. So the first one is LEED, which is Leadership in Energy and Environmental Design, which is administered through the U.S. Green Building Council. So this offers a bunch of different types of certification. The one you're probably most familiar with is new construction, but there's also certifications available for major renovations, for operations and maintenance, for interior spaces and things like that. So LEED is a point system. You can earn up to 100 points in the 6 categories that are shown on the screen, plus an extra 10 points for regional priority and 6 for innovation and design. So if you're coming up with something brand new, if you're choosing to house your building somewhere that is an especially efficient place for a building to be, like in a city. So to get LEED certified, you have to get at least 40 points, and then there are 3 different categories: silver, gold, and platinum. So LEED is kind of the one everyone knows. At this point, it sets industry standards for new buildings especially. It's well recognized, it's an independent certification, and it's really pushed the industry to gain knowledge and expertise in the environmental impact of buildings. But at this point, a lot of people think it's kind of greenwashing. You can get points for doing things like adding only the minimum number of parking spaces. So a lot of people figured out kind of how to game the system and get the maximum number of points without really looking into their building's energy usage. LEED is also based off of computer models and not on the actual performance of the building. So if your building is designed perfectly, but then when people use it and change things around, then that makes a big difference, and it's probably not performing as well as the points would indicate. And finally, it is super costly, so typically only larger companies are pursuing the certification. So the next one I wanted to highlight was Energy Star, which you might have seen a sticker for on your refrigerator, things like that. So Energy Star is really well known for appliance ratings, but it also does ratings for buildings, especially residential and commercial, and just recently, within the past couple of years, it's expanded to multifamily apartments. So this also has a score out of 100, but unlike LEED, the score is a percentile. So if your building scores, say, 75, that means it performs better than 75% of similar buildings nationwide. So 75 is typically what it takes to get Energy Star certified. The certifications also must be renewed annually with a new score each time. So this means that your score is based on your actual performance and not the modeled performance. But this kind of also brings up an issue of a shifting baseline. So if all buildings are really inefficient, or if all buildings get super efficient, this certification wouldn't provide a lot of useful information. And it only focuses on energy. It doesn't really look at healthy aspects of energy efficiency, ensure there's no mold or asbestos or anything like that. It's strictly focused on oil, gas, electricity usage. So then the last one that I wanted to highlight is the Living Building Challenge, which was originally launched by the Cascadia Green Building Council, which is a chapter of USGBC, the same thing that administers LEED. So it was launched in 2006, and it's now overseen by the International Living Building Institute. And this one has 7 performance categories, which you can see in the picture. The building must have 0 net energy and water usage to qualify for challenge certification, and it has to prove its performance over a 12-month period. So this is a much more holistic than the other 2 certifications. So in addition to energy performance, it looks at things like site location. So a building will have more of a chance of getting it if it is built on a brownfield or if it promotes some sort of car-free living. This certification also looks at health, so it looks at air quality and the materials that are used during the process to avoid things like asbestos and mercury. And finally, it's the only one of these that really looks at equity issues like environmental justice and the human scale of the building. So as a result, this is an extremely rigorous certification with very high targets. The bad, it's very complicated to get this, and we're still trying to figure out how this works in taller buildings and urban settings. So this might be a focus on the community that the building is in as well as the building itself. So we want to see kind of what experiences you've had with these certifications, what kind of buildings you've seen in your communities that have inspired you to think about energy efficiency. So this is going to be our first in-class activity, and it's going to be a little scavenger hunt on the internet. So we have a link to, in the class files, to basically some blank slides, and I will share these right now. All right, so I should have just shared the link. So the activity is find a building in your community that has one of these certifications. LEED, Living Building Challenge, anything like that. Something that you've noticed, or something, if you haven't noticed, just Google like your community and see what comes up. And then answer for us, what innovations or technologies did it use, and where do you think that the building could have gone better? Like, what could it have done to become more efficient? So I think we'll give you about 5 or 10 minutes. Feel free to jot down your thoughts in the shared file, add a picture, and then we'll come back, maybe get some volunteers to talk about the buildings that you found. So.
Yeah, you'll find in the slides that Karen shared there that we have an example. This was from the class last year from a student at Georgia Tech. It was a well done image and example of a building in their community. So try to find something in your own community. Grab a slide all your own. If you're really struggling, you can team up and help a colleague of yours to research their building. But there should be plenty out there for you to do. If you're having trouble accessing, just go ahead and send a request, and we will request to share the files, and we will make sure that it's shared with you, especially if your Drive account is linked to a different email than the one you registered with. You may not initially have access, but we will try to do that as quickly as possible here. In the meantime, too, if you have any questions on what Karen did, please do send those over, and we'll be happy to discuss and answer them while you guys are researching. Karen, while they're doing that, a question I saw come in here. Can you talk a little bit more? You mentioned limitations of living building challenge in tall buildings. Are there specific examples of what you think the key limitations there are?
I'm not totally sure. I think a lot of it looks at, it's really interesting to look at like the gray water usage, how the space is designed, and it works really well in smaller spaces, but I think a lot of the energy management of larger buildings makes it difficult to look at the net energy and water, especially use on the larger skyscraper scale. Rob, do you have any other thoughts about that?
Yeah, I think you hit it. I think you hit it right on. The net energy and net water tend to be the hardest ones. Water simply because you can't necessarily collect enough to replenish what's used, even if you're treating everything on site, and energy because if you don't have sufficient roof area to generate or some other novel way of generating electricity, you're not going to be able to power the building on site. And right now, it's Living Building Challenge really incentivizes generating the energy on site rather than purchasing it from off site. So until some of those are worked out, it's really tough. The tallest building that's been Living Building certified is the Bullitt Center in Seattle, which I think is in the neighborhood of 6 to 10 stories, and I can't remember exactly. If somebody's looking for a building to do, that's an interesting one. But there even they were pressed to get net zero energy with some really advanced technologies in the basement and everything. One other certification, Karen, I don't know if you're familiar with it, that I think is particularly interesting too, is the well building certification, which is completely organized around health. So it doesn't really have so much to do with energy, but it's the first one that I've seen, and it's only been around a few years, that really looks at healthy building interiors. I know that LEED has a component of it and LBC has a component of it, but this one's purely dedicated to the workspace environment. I think it's an interesting effort. I don't know much about it, but it seems cool. Are you at all familiar with it, or?
I am not familiar with that one. The certifications I'm familiar with are more for contractors.
Sure.
Building Professional Institute looks specifically at single and multifamily homes, and that does have a pretty big focus on health as well as energy usage. But that's more for evaluating evaluating existing buildings and figuring out how they can improve.
Cool, yeah.
All right, I'm seeing a lot of buildings from RIT here, which is awesome. That's my hometown. I'll give everyone a couple more minutes to finish up, and then I did an example as well. So let's regroup in about 2 minutes, and we'll see what examples people came up with.
That TED Talk that she links to there, Karen, is a really fascinating one. I've seen her speak at other events. Jessica Green, she's quite interesting. I would encourage everybody, if you've got the time to watch it later. I'm sorry, Andrew linked to it here, I believe. Not that Karen linked it again as well. It's a wonderful talk, and she thinks a lot about the microclimate or microbiome of buildings on a microbiological level, which is a really interesting way to think about productivity, about what's actually contributing to health in human-occupied spaces. Thanks, Karen, for sharing that.
All right. So it looks like people are pretty much finishing up their slides at this point. So I can share my example first, Rob, if you want to go to the Elevate Energy Headquarters slide.
Elevate Energy. Found it.
All right. So this is the office where I work, and it was recently certified LEED Gold for interior design and construction. So my company leases this office. It's one floor in a building in downtown Chicago of about 5 floors. So we had to pursue specifically the interior LEED certification because we didn't own the building and couldn't do a lot outside of our one floor. But within our floor, there is almost entirely LED lighting. 97% of the appliances that were installed are ENERGY STAR rated. There's a lot of natural daylight and all sorts of good things. That's also an important part of like the sustainable sites side of things. It's very centrally located, extremely close to a couple of train stations in downtown Chicago, and we have something like 26 bike racks inside, which is really nice from the standpoint of people like to steal bikes a lot in Chicago, so having somewhere to store it inside makes people more likely to commute to work via bike. But on the negative side, it's a little bit overlit, and a lot of the staff will complain that they get migraines from the extremely bright LEDs. So the solution that we came up with was to kind of like put paper over them to dim it, which is a little counterproductive to the energy efficiency idea because we're like, why are we even using that bright of an LED anyway? And there are also some HVAC balance issues. People tend to adjust thermostats, and over time, the heating within the floor gets kind of uneven. There are cold spots, there are hot spots, and it's just not operating the best that it could. So we do have people on site who kind of recalibrate it every so often, but that's an area for improvement. Is there anyone else who wants to volunteer? You can raise your hand. We'll unmute you.
Yeah, we would love to hear from a couple of you who found some interesting buildings.
I'll just call on people. So how about, who did the RIT Golisano Institute for Sustainability? All right.
Got a hand raised somewhere here. Gabriel.
Yep, so you should be unmuted.
Yeah,
All right,
I clicked the wrong button.
We can hear you, Gabriel.
Oh, great. What do you want to know?
So do you want to just give us an overview of the building, what's really cool about it, and maybe if you think there are any areas for improvement?
They addressed a lot of issues, a lot of different ways. Like the stuff that's listed out there, I think covers. You have to look at a lot of aspects when designing sustainable buildings. Like one, it's not a one solution fits all kind of thing. So they did a really good job of addressing a lot of the problems, especially for the location. Upstate New York is pretty temperamental, and you can have 70 degree day one day, and then the next day it's freezing and snowing, and so I think they did a great job, especially with the geothermal. I didn't know about that for a long time until um, this past year, and apparently that helps with heating costs and whatnot. Oh, they've got like fish tanks, so yeah, I don't know if you can see the orange little meeting spaces that they have. Yeah, right there. That I've been inside those, and the lighting is really, really nice, especially on a bright day.
Karen, sounds like your building could learn a trick or two from our IT here.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah. It's all the they're kind of it's your basic open office concept, and there are these kind of pods, and they have these rings of light on top of them. So the ones that are not with the window, not like right next to the windows, have some problems.
Yeah. Gabriel, anything that you think could be improved in this particular building?
I mean, I'm no expert, but I'm not sure. They have a lot of open space. That's what I like. Oops. Oh, geez. Sorry about that.
No worries.
Nothing really comes to mind. Oh, except for the turbines that we have. It's an ongoing joke that they're pretty useless, especially with the location. Yeah,
Yeah, they're right out here in front of the building for those who can't see them in the image or haven't been to this particular location.
yeah, they're on the north side. Apparently they don't even produce as much energy as they could for a location in New York, which doesn't have too much wind compared to the rest of the U.S., but they look nice, so.
They do. They do. Yeah. Great. Well, thanks for sharing, Gabriel. And we'll talk a little bit more next week about how to identify things that aren't working so well in buildings. But I do want to pick up on one thing you said, not pick up on. And that's that you said, I'm no expert. Well, the reality is that usually it's not the experts who help those of us who are figure out what's not working, because we run models all day, and then it's not until somebody gets in the space that we find out that, oh no, that didn't work the way it was supposed to. So never think that because you're not an expert, you can't contribute, because honestly, that's what we need as professionals who do this. So thanks for sharing, Gabriel. I'm going to mute you again here, and I've got a hand up here. We'll go one more here. Lainey, I've unmuted you if you've got a microphone and want to share what you've been working on, or did you have a question? Or
yeah, I just wanted to add on to that. I'm assuming you guys
can
hear me? Or?
Yes, we can.
Okay, all right, great. So yeah, I also go to RIT, so I was actually just going to mention the fact that in the back there, those wind turbines probably aren't the most efficient thing right now, just because of like its location and how close it is to the building. It's blocking a lot of the wind that it could get. And just something else I thought of, you can see that there's a lot of like window panels, so a lot of natural light can come in, which I can see how that'd be a good thing, but I'm sure that at certain points that really heats up the building, and if they don't take that into account, then I can see why that would cause some problems. But.
Yeah, wind turbines in urban environments turn out to be one of the hardest things to do because of all of the disparate things that obstruct wind or that contribute to poor wind performance. It's a nice statement that they've done them. It's no knock on the designer of this building that they're not working as well as they could.
All right.
But yeah, thank you for sharing that, Lainey. It's much appreciated.
Thanks. I think we have time for one more. So who wrote about the Phipps Conservatory in Pittsburgh? All right. You should be unmuted.
Hey, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so Phipps Conservatory is just like a giant garden place where they have like different environments for different types of plants. Like they'll have a cactus room and they'll have a tropical rainforest room right next to it with like plants you've never seen before. So I've been there a couple of times and it's really cool. So apparently they're Living Building Challenge certified, LEED Platinum. They designed it to be one of the greenest buildings in the world. and with the certifications they got, I guess they're coming close. I guess some of the coolest things were that it has its entire solar panel farm in the back of it, so it generates all its own energy, and right around it there's like bike lanes for miles, so it's very friendly for bike commuting, which is what I do when I go there. So there's bike racks and such. So those were the two coolest things for me.
Awesome. Yeah, I used to live in Pittsburgh and loved going to Phipps. And the sustainable, the building in the back, the one that is Living Building Challenge certified, it was brand new when I was there. So it was really nice taking a tour and seeing all the ridiculous things they did to get it to zero energy. So I remember one thing that I thought was really neat was they have a wall that faces where the sun comes up that's concrete, so it absorbs all of the heat from the sun in the morning and uses that to heat the building throughout the day. So I thought that was a really smart way to deal with how to heat and cool the space.
Yeah, it's a pretty amazing building.
That's awesome. Yeah, thanks for sharing, Abhinav.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you.
I'm going to go ahead and mute you again here. All of these are great examples. I encourage you all to take a look at some of the others as well in offline. Take a look at some of the other examples that your classmates came up with here. One that I want to highlight here as well very quickly is the one that I added in here, which is a building at Stanford. And just going back to the comment earlier about what users can add to the building. I call on this example because it was designed by a couple of the best firms in the country, architecturally and engineering-wise, and yet when it opened was performing at 200% of the anticipated energy use. So that's twice what they thought it would consume, because the assumptions that were made in the energy modeling were not representative of how students actually use the buildings. So for instance, they thought it was an office building, therefore it's a 9 in the morning to 5 p.m., right? Students are more like 24-hour animals, so the building was being used all the time, and in fact it was over-consuming energy because of that. Other things, they modeled laptops as being the primary computing loads, but engineering students, hey, we have 6 monitors each. So little things like that that add up when you actually start to put an energy model together. So you'll start to notice these things, and as you think about some of the assignments, some of the buildings around you for your assignment this coming week, one of the things we'll ask you to do is take a look at where the building's using a lot of energy and what you could do to reduce that. And perhaps some of the lessons from the buildings we've just talked about, Y2E2 at Stanford, others might be interesting things to think about. Even if it doesn't seem like it's wasted energy, what could we do? Do we really need that many monitors, or does it really need to be open all the time? Things like this are just interesting questions that are user-defined, and we have to really interact with those if we're going to design good buildings. A couple of other final notes before we move on here. Two other RIT students chimed in here. One other RIT student chimed in, excuse me, to say that so she was told by a student pursuing her PhD that the turbines were originally supposed to be on the other side of the building, but they were put near the parking lot to look nice and be welcoming, which would partly contribute to the wind concern. So a lot of reasons why that decision might have been made, and also speaks to the fact that in buildings, it's not just about energy. It's about all these other things we have to consider, whether that's health or aesthetics. They really drive decisions in ways that may be less optimal for energy performance. So with that, we're going to move on, and let me grab, here we are. Going to jump back into the slides here. And thank you everybody for engaging with that. We really appreciate jumping in and doing these activities. We think they're a nice way to learn, and one of the unique things about this course is that we get a chance to actually interact with each other and see in real time some different experiences from across the country. So now I want to broaden the conversation back a bit to energy efficiency in general and what that means for buildings. And this is a question that I always like to use when framing energy efficiency, which is, why do we actually care about it? Energy is something that we use every day, whether it's electricity or thermal energy or fuel to move around. And in fact, it's something that is so critical to modern life that it's considered a fundamental human right and a basic right that we fight to give access to across the developing world. In fact, in this country, it was determined to be something that every person had to have access to in the 1930s with the Rural Electrification Act. So if it's so critical, why do we care about efficiency? And specifically in buildings, why do we care about efficiency? Well, one of the other tools that we teach in ESW, and one of the things that I use in a lot of my research and my activities, is life cycle assessment. And what life cycle assessment is a way of looking at the entire lifetime of a product or a building from its inception at its very raw materials to its use and finally to its disposal. And what we find is that in buildings, the energy consumption, specifically the electricity and natural gas consumption for lighting, heating, cooling, and all of the other end uses that we might have, it's more than 80% of the impact of that building on the environment. It's more than 80% of the greenhouse gas emissions, somewhere near 90%. It creates most of the pollution that the building will produce in its lifetime through, again, air emissions predominantly, but also in things like waste. Even including all of the impacts that it took to, say, make the concrete, which concrete's not the most environmentally friendly material, or steel, it's that period of electricity and natural gas use that's the majority of it. Now, even as we start to improve some of our regulations on energy, we see that it drops from 83% to 65%, perhaps, in new buildings in California, which has some of the strictest energy regulations in the country, by the way. Even as we get down to net zero energy, it still is a fairly significant percentage of the consumption of the building. Now, what's interesting to note here is if we look at the fraction, though, that energy has to play, as we reduce that energy consumption more and more and we produce some of it on site, the share of everything else, in this case the materials rather than the energy use, goes up relative to the total footprint of the building. So it is something to consider that energy gets us most of the way there, but it's never going to be everything that the building contributes. That said, as I said, efficiency is important because it's the majority of the load. I already touched on this initially, but the impact goes beyond just the building itself to think about how these scale across the country. Most of you probably follow the news in December as the Conference of Parties 21 in Paris reached an agreement on greenhouse gas emissions, and every country contributed some amount that they said they would reduce their emissions. Well, in the United States, one of the ways that we have to meet our goal is by reducing electric power consumption. Electric power is the single largest source of carbon emissions in this country. Now, not all of that is for buildings, of course. That contributes every use, that includes every use of energy consumption or electricity consumption across the country. But as you see here from the right side, home energy use is about 27% of the average individual's carbon footprint. In fact, of this electric power segment, most of it, about 80% of it, goes to buildings, residential and commercial buildings. About 20% of it is left over for things like the small amount of electric transportation infrastructure that we have and for process loads within different industries. Some of it, to be fair, is also lost in distribution. But the bulk of it, about a third, fully a third of our U.S. carbon emissions, come from the electricity consumption in buildings. So there's real reasons why politically, globally, environmentally, we want to care about energy efficiency. If you need more motivation, one last set of stats here from the Energy Information Administration, the United States, shows us that, even though we've been deploying those renewables and we've been getting cleaner and cleaner electricity, still the bulk of our energy in this country comes from fuels that are non-renewable, and specifically in natural gas and coal, fuels that have that high environmental footprint. So even though we are doing better, and I don't want to discount the improvement, we still have a long way to go, and reducing energy use will just make that share of renewables look even better. Because when we reduce energy, what we're doing on the electricity mix is taking it out typically of natural gas and sometimes coal. It doesn't get reduced at all from that renewables fraction. So it's not like, hey, if we're reducing a kilowatt hour of electricity, we're evenly reducing all of our sources. It's actually coming off of some of the most polluting sources in the country, which is great news. It means that the more we save, the better the impact actually is. But okay, let's propose one more thought question here, and that is that we're on track if you look at the statistics that I just showed you from the EIA, renewables are growing, from the commitments that were made in Paris in December and all of the policy initiatives that the Obama administration and others have created, pushing towards 100% renewable energy. We're probably going to get there 2050, 2080, somewhere in that ballpark. So let's take that future of 100% renewable energy. Well, why would we care then at that point about energy efficiency? It doesn't pollute. There are really few environmental impacts at that point. As we saw, most of the impact is in use, not in generation or creation of the energy technologies themselves. So why would we care about it? I find this an interesting philosophical question, but it has some real actual practical answers. So for instance, if we think about solar panels are manufactured using an incredibly energy-intensive process. Well, we've already dealt with that, right? We're saying in this scenario that energy is completely clean. It's 100% renewable. Even so, we've got some very interesting inputs into our process here. We've got some silicon. Of course, most solar panels are made from silicon, and that's actually the best environmentally of all the materials that we could make solar panels out of, at least today. Cadmium, telluride, these have other issues when we try to mine them and refine them. But then to get the silicon to the purity that we need it and to etch it in order to be able to put the carriers of silver and copper and other metals to take those electrons away, we use acids. We use hydrochloric acid. We use other chemicals that then end up in the environment through this process. So even if we have all of our energy coming from renewables and the majority of it from solar, in the process of manufacturing all those solar panels, we have things like toxic off-gases. We have hydrogen that's produced and that we don't have a good source for, that is a good sink for. That's potentially an explosion hazard, safety hazard for those working in the fuels. We have acidic residues. We have toxicity that comes from that. And just mining all of those metals has its own share of impacts, whether that's land use, societal in terms of people who have to actually mine those materials and put themselves in occupational hazards to satisfy that demand, or whether it's degradation of habitat and area for wildlife. So again, going back to why this relates to efficiency, well, if we reduce the demand, if we're more efficient with what we do produce, fewer solar panels that we actually have to make and fewer impacts that cascade back to the original sources of those materials. Another reason that we might want to care about energy efficiency is that that whole process I just described is really expensive. This is a really famous image from the McKinsey Consulting Group. It's now a little bit out of date. As you see, it's real $2005, but there hasn't really been a good update of it since, and every year I check and try to find this, not just for this course, but for my own gratification. But what this tells us is that everything in green here is an efficiency measure. It's improving things like electronics or lighting. It's improving the insulation in the buildings down here when we talk about new shell improvements. It's talking about water heaters and control systems. Now, everything that's got a bar below the x-axis means that it not only is affordable, it pays for itself in its lifetime. It actually makes us a profit in its lifetime per ton of carbon that we're removing from the atmosphere. Everything with a positive return, we're actually paying to remove carbon from the environment. And you see we've got a couple of efficiency measures up here, but most of these things look like generation, distributed solar, concentrated solar, coal capture and storage. Now, granted, these prices have changed a little bit in the last decade. Most notably, solar has plummeted to the point where solar is a lot more in the mid-range of this chart now, but it's still not as cheap as some of our efficiency measures. So again, there's never enough money to go around, right? The more that we do efficiency as opposed to renewable generation, the better we're going to look on this curve as well. To emphasize that some more, let's think about storage. Everybody says that if we're going to deploy a lot of solar, a lot of wind, we're also going to need a lot of storage. Tesla has the cheapest battery pack on the market right now. Their competitors are quickly trying to catch up with them, but it doesn't look like they will anytime soon, given their new factory initiative in Nevada, which, by the way, if you're not familiar with what I'm talking about, go look it up. It's the Tesla Gigafactory in Nevada, and look up their Tesla Power Pack as well. So even if this world were entirely off-grid, we have storage, we have solar, we're moving that energy around because obviously we only produce when the sun shines, so we have to store it and redeploy it when we need it later. Even if we do that, let's take a look at the capital costs without doing any energy efficiency and with energy efficiency. And what we see is that, yes, we could do solar and storage, and we could satisfy all the energy we need in any market in the country, but by doing that energy efficiency, we're saving ourselves a lot of money. In some cases, almost half of what we'd be spending without doing that efficiency. So anybody who looks at this is going to agree. It makes financial sense for you, for me, or for whoever the implementing party is. Not to mention, we don't actually know if there's enough mineable lithium in the world to satisfy an entire demand for an entire economy that produces energy, stores it, and redeploys it without doing energy efficiency, especially as we get to 12 billion people on the planet, many of whom are going to be growing their energy footprint substantially. The last, perhaps, motivation that we need is that energy efficiency is rapidly becoming the law. Karen talked a little bit about voluntary measures, certification standards, but in states like California and Texas, Wisconsin, Florida, Maine, all the ones in green listed here, there are actual standards for energy efficiency that are not just for appliances, but for also for buildings. Currently, as you see, it encompasses about 2 out of 3 customers, electricity customers in the country, are subjected to some sort of building energy efficiency law. Again, as of April 2013, but there's no updated image that I could find. And what that means is that you have to do it to comply. If you're going to build a new building, if you're going to retrofit a building, you actually have to do this in order to meet the law. Now again, the reason for that comes back to all of the drivers that we've already talked about. It's either carbon emissions, or it's cost, or in some cases it's a feeling from the electric utility like they're either going to have to invest in new generation, lay out a lot of new money that gets passed on to the consumers, or they can pay less and have you save the money so they don't have to create that new generation. Many people have been skeptical, of energy efficiency regulation at points in the past, but now with 30, 40 years hindsight from when these measures were first put in, we've seen that they actually do work. It's not just that people put in new light bulbs or put in new equipment and then they operate it more hours of the year, or they leave the lights on because they think they can to save energy. Energy efficiency regulation has actually driven a huge change in the amount of electricity consumed and therefore in the amount of carbon that's been produced. So here we can look at 1975 when California first enacted its energy efficiency laws following the OPEC oil crisis in 1973. And you can see since then, California has more or less stayed stagnant in the amount of energy, electricity that's consumed per person relative per person per year, relative to the rest of the country, which has continued on an upward trajectory. This is a combination of standards around appliances and buildings as well, but really goes to show that these regulations do have the ability to work and to make a substantial change in the amount of energy that's consumed. Now granted, this is also while the economy has kept growing. So that's another big criticism sometimes of energy efficiency, is that it would hurt the economy. Definitely not true if we look at the California case. Now, as if all these things weren't enough, there's one last thing that we really have to consider, and that I alluded to it or mentioned it in passing already, and that's that so far we've taken a very US-centric frame to the problem of energy and energy efficiency in buildings. The US has historically been the largest contributor both to greenhouse gas emissions globally, to energy consumption globally. However, that may be changing, and it's not because others are suddenly saying that they can and should consume more. It's because of what I mentioned maybe about 10 minutes ago, that energy is essentially a fundamental right. It's a fundamental issue of access. It contributes to productivity and economic growth. What we're seeing is that the US and Canada still lead in terms of electricity consumption per household per year, but we have a large number of very populous and very quickly growing nations that are starting to catch up. And this is a wonderful thing, that they are catching up. All of these countries down here, China, Mexico, Nigeria, India, Brazil, have the capacity to greatly improve the quality of life for all of their residents, or the vast majority of their residents, by increasing access to electricity, by increasing access to energy, and we want to enable that to happen. Inherently, this is not a bad thing that their energy footprint is growing. In fact, over here it's undersized relative to the lifestyles that those individuals should be or could be leading. However, one thing that we need to consider in all of this is how are we going to be supplying that, and does it actually need to grow to the level that it has in the United States and Canada? Arguably, we can bring our footprints way down, so can Australia and France and probably Japan as well, and we can meet happily somewhere in the middle where we're using less electricity overall as a globe, or maybe just marginally more, and then we pair that with supplying it more efficiently and with a carbon-free or cleaner methodology. Part of what drives this, and I've shown it here at the bottom, is the floor space for housing. You see the United States, Australia, and Canada lead in the largest amount of floor space, and just inherently, when we're heating and cooling, the more floor space we have, the more energy we're going to use. Same thing with lighting. And you see that here, countries like China and Hong Kong and Russia, they're not using that much floor space per person. So the energy consumption is going to be lower, but again, likely to change. These countries and these residents are aspiring to that. And to the extent that they can do it and not impact other issues, other things such as habitat, maybe that's a good thing. So last thing here, these countries are growing. The countries, China is growing, India is growing, rural residents are moving to urban, and with that comes a change and an increase in energy consumption. We've seen the per capita annual residential use in China grow year on year, and we expect it to continue to grow as more devices penetrate the market and as more people move to the urban environment. So just to keep in mind, does efficiency matter? Absolutely, because the more residents change their habits in these countries, the more people in our country continue to consume energy or fail to reduce. That's just more electricity resource that we're going to have to provide. We're already going to have to satisfy the demands just to get everybody to a level of having that basic resource. Without efficiency, we're going to have to produce that much more. And again, with that we have the material impacts, we have some of the health and safety impacts, we have the non-carbon impacts that I mentioned earlier. That's really a whirlwind. I know, that's a lot that I've given in the last 25 minutes, and it'll take perhaps some time to sink in. So think about it, and it's a huge tangled issue. As soon as we talk about any of these sustainability challenges, energy and buildings are just one aspect, one facet of this entire issue, but a really important one. If I had a few takeaways for you to leave with, it's this. Building energy is a huge contributor to carbon emissions currently in our country and globally. Energy efficiency is one of the main levers that we have because honestly our appliances and our buildings use a ton more energy than they should, and Karen and I will talk about that in the coming weeks. And we're only going to grow in the amount of energy that people will be using globally. And while that's a good thing, we also want to keep in mind how to control it to a certain extent without impacting quality of life, so that we don't have some of these ancillary impacts of land use, toxicity, and material generation and consumption. So with that, I will leave you now. I'm 3 minutes over time. I hope you will forgive me for that. A couple of things to leave you with, aside from my final philosophic thoughts that I just provided. Next week, we'll be here at the same time, same place. Karen's going to be delivering the lecture next week and talking about existing buildings, audits, and retrofits. This is her world. She is one of the best people to talk about this that I know. She's an absolute expert, so please do come with any questions that you've got. In advance of that, she has some slides from a group called Action Housing in Pittsburgh that she'd like you to look over. They're on our Google Drive. There's a link here, and you'll be getting a link to them by email as well, either tonight or tomorrow in a summary wrap-up. And then there's also an assignment that we'd like you to do, and it's picking up on what we did in class today, but that's to take a little bit more time. To take a house or an office building, does not have to be a certified building at all, just whatever building you spend a lot of time in. Walk around and take some notes on where you think energy is being consumed, where it might be wasted, and how you can improve that whole process. So for instance, I'm sitting in an office building right now in San Francisco, and there's clearly energy use around me in lighting and in heating and cooling, so I might take some notes on that and think about, are there ways this building could be improved? And I guarantee you there are. This is not one of the best buildings in the city, but it's a pretty good one. When you do that, just create a Google document or a Word document, upload it to Google Drive. It does not have to be an essay, just some notes, some bullets, some lists, whatever format works. If you'd like to write paragraphs, that's great. We'll read some of those and share some of the responses at the beginning of next week's class as well. As always, if you've got any questions, you can email me at rbest@eswusa.org. You can also email Karen. She's at kaminsky@eswusa.org. You'll get those email addresses as well on the wrap-up. If you've got any other questions, please feel free. And again, if you're watching this on the YouTube link later, do feel free to add in your own building to the in-class assignment. Please do go ahead and do the assignment, submit that online. If you want to add something into the in-class, we'll take a look at that again before next week's session as well. If there's some cool new buildings, we'll highlight them too. So with that, 5 minutes over, apologies. Wonderful start to the class. Thank you so much for engaging. I look forward to seeing you all here next week at the same time. And in the meantime, enjoy your week and enjoy learning about the buildings around you. Take care.